Hello and welcome back to Drilled. I'm Amy Westervelt. Whew, quite a start to the year here. If you haven't already listened to it, I recommend going back and listening to our season on Guyana. It has a lot to do with what's happening in Venezuela right now. And in other news, unfortunately, the episode that we're bringing to you today is quite timely. Our Australia reporter, Royce Kermelovs, spoke with Canadian author John Vaillant at the Byron Writers Festival last year about John's book, Fireweather. We were already planning to bring you that conversation this week, but now the entire state of Victoria is under an extreme fire danger warning. It's bringing back memories of the terrible fire season in Australia just a few years back. There are spot fires burning in New South Wales and South Australia as well. So I can't think of a better time to bring you this conversation. Hope you enjoy it. Here it is.
Hello and welcome to the 2 p.m. session here at Byron Writers Festival. I am Royce Kermelovs. I will be your host for this session. I'm very excited to be here today with you to talk about this wonderfully written book that is both exquisitely written and, as one writer for the New York Times described it, unfortunately exquisitely timed. The book is Fireweather, a true story from a hotter world, which you can see here. I'm holding up very conveniently. The story it tells is about a Canadian oil town that experienced a catastrophic bushfire in 2016. And though it describes events a world away, for many of us here in Australia, it'll be deeply familiar and for many people in this region. And this powerfully drawn book is about many things. It's harrowing, it's about fire, it's about climate change, and it's about the particular talent for self-harm that we as a species appear to show for ourselves. The author of this fine book is John Vaillant, who is here with me today. And for those who don't know him, John is an author and a writer and has traveled halfway around the world to be here. So could you please all make him feel warmly welcome in Byron Bay? And just before we get into it, I want to be just a heads up. We will be taking questions in this session. So in about 45 minutes, a volunteer will come around with a microphone. So if you have your questions, hold on to them till then. We do ask that the questions are a question, and again, keep them short so we can get as many in as possible to kind of get as much good information as we can out. And if you want to have more of a conversation with John, you're more than welcome to do so over at the book signing tent with a copy of the book when after the show. So, John, I wanted to kind of open this conversation with you by asking the question, there are many fires in many places, but what drew you to this one?
Yes. First of all, I would like to say thanks to the Tasmanian Walking Company and also to all of you. I'm really glad to be here with you. And also, I have to say off the top, I feel rather sheepish coming to Australia to talk about fire when Australia has kind of written the book on fire in many ways, and a lot of us are up north are learning from you and watching in fascination and horror, as you reach new heights of flammability. But we're keeping pace up in Canada. We're doing our part, and Fort McMurray, which caught on fire on May 3rd, 2016, and drove the largest, most rapid evacuation due to fire in modern times, caught my attention before any of us knew that, really because it disappeared from the face of the earth for a while. And I'm not a climate journalist. I write about, every book is about a different subject. I've written about a man-eating tiger in Russia and a botanically unique tree in British Columbia and other things. But so fire was not really on my radar. And I was working on a novel in Italy at a very swank writer's retreat and made the mistake of looking at Twitter and this petroleum hub of Canada. Canada's the 4th or 5th largest petroleum producer in the world. And the hub of that industry had completely disappeared beneath a 40,000-foot tall pyrocumulonimbus fire cloud. And that was on May 3rd, 2016. And nobody knew. There were 80, 90,000 people in there. You can see the cars streaming out. There's only one road out. They were streaming out like ants to the horizon, and nobody knew who was left in there, and nobody knew for days. It was really frightening, kind of at a national level. It's a nationally important city. It is home to the highest wages in the whole city. I think you have some of that here. You have a great name for it.
The Pilbara?
And the name for the people who make spectacular wages working there. But
yes, the cashed out bogans, I think is the phrase.
Yeah, the cashed out bogans. Well, this is what Fort McMurray is famous for. And the median household income there, even after a global downturn in petroleum prices, was $200,000 a year, making it one of the wealthiest municipalities in all of North America, and that's including, Marin County and Westchester, New York. So it's a very, very powerful place, and the idea that it could be wiped off the face of the earth in an afternoon was deeply threatening and terrifying. And I dropped the novel and started paying attention. So
on that, so just to contextualize this place a little bit more for people in the audience who may not be familiar, I mean, we in Australia have the coal industry, we have the gas industry, we have centers of mining and extraction such as the Pilbara, other places. But am I right that the specific industry in this place was the tar sands?
Yeah.
So can you just explain what they are?
The tar sands are a total anomaly. There are tar sands in Venezuela also that produce petroleum, but tar sand is bitumen-soaked sand. And bitumen, if you don't know, it's what you seal your driveway with. It's what you seal a house foundation with. It's a tarry liquid substance. You can't really burn it, unless you heat it way above normal combustive temperatures. It's not oil or gas in the sense that most of us understand it. And it has to be mined out of the ground. And this industry has altered, basically destroyed 1,000 square miles of the northern boreal forest. And as they use gigantic shovels, much like coal mining, to dig this stuff out, and then in order to process it, you have to melt it with billions of cubic feet of natural gas just to render it into a liquid form that can then be piped 1,000 miles south to an American refinery for processing, where it needs more natural gas to refine it. So it is probably the least efficient, most environmentally destructive, most costly petroleum product anywhere on Earth. And the math that makes it work is fuzzy, to say the least.
And what kind of gravity does this place have because of the tar sands within Canadian politics and society?
So Alberta is the Texas of Canada. It's a very conservative state. It's pretty much owned by the petroleum industry. The petroleum industry, really across most of North America, controls a lot of the political discourse to an unwholesome degree. The amount of lobbying hours and energy that goes on in Ottawa, the capital of Canada, or in D.C. is shocking, to say the least. And so Alberta is kind of a beneficiary of that. I would say it's the way information is controlled there. It's sort of small f fascist. And, I'm really sorry to say that. I'm a Canadian, a generally proud Canadian, but, Alberta is a problematic place in complete denial about climate change, like Texas, like Washington, D.C. now. And it's basically in servitude to this so far very lucrative but extraordinarily destructive petroleum industry. And it creates a very weird tension where incredible wages can be garnered, but also the same, mostly men, it's about 25-1 up there, men to women, also live in enormous precarity because they can be laid off at any time. They get on the hook for a $100,000 F-150 or a house, and then they can lose it all. And it's a very kind of hyper and unstable situation that has a lot of casualties come out of it.
And so I want to get you to explain what happened in a second, but just before we move into that, what you've described means that when we talk about this catastrophic fire in this place, there was a kind of poetry in what happened. right?
Well, it's a strange circularity. So the bitumen industry of Canada, of Fort McMurray, to put this in perspective, Canada is the largest foreign supplier of petroleum to the United States. It's the biggest source of foreign exports. About 4 million barrels a day of diluted bitumen runs out of Fort McMurray down into American refineries. It's a colossal amount of potential energy. And so Fort McMurray is the biggest emitter in the country of CO2. And the idea of a climate-enhanced wildfire that was behaving in ways no one had ever seen before, the idea that this fire would not only threaten but actually overrun the entire city was kind of on the nose, really. And yet it happened. And I think what was surprising is how hard it was, even when the fire was in front of people's faces, how hard it was for them to believe that this was actually happening and happening to them.
And you do a very good job in the book of describing how, when this began, that the fire kind of began over the hill as a distant problem not to think about. Can you talk about how this began and what happened to this place?
So the boreal forest of northern Canada, it runs actually all the way around the world. So the Russian taiga is basically boreal forest. It continues across into North America, across Alaska, all the way across northern Canada. It's the wettest biome on Earth, wetter than the tropical jungle. Huge rivers, small oceans, inland seas of lakes, and it's terribly flammable. So there are species there, just like here, that will not regenerate unless they're burned. So it's normal for the boreal forest to burn, and this city is an isolated city 5 hours driving from the nearest other major source of assistance, which is Edmonton. Terribly isolated, and so fires surround it every summer and every spring. And so there's this strange comfort with smoke plumes on the horizon, but also this magical compact that they seem to have that, well, the fires burn out there, but they'll never come into our city. And that had worked for 50 years, and nature, is not here to make agreements with human beings or their ambitions. Nature is here responding to the forces that influence it. And what we had on May 3rd, 2016 was a temperature record for that day broken by 6 degrees Celsius, and we had relative humidity of 11%, and that might make your eyes roll back, and it's not an interesting subject to me until I started looking at where 11% humidity is normal. And 11% humidity is normal in North America in Death Valley in the month of July. The driest, hottest place on the continent. And now those conditions have been transposed to one of the most flammable ecosystems on Earth. And we've had 2 years of drought. And so those trees didn't just catch on fire, they exploded into flame. And at about 1 in the afternoon, a 10-kilometer wide wave of fire, 100 meters tall, swept into the city. And it came fast and burnt through the city day and night for a week. And I think the only other fire that's lasted that, urban fire that's lasted that long is the Great Fire of London in 1666. And those were some different conditions.
And so how did the people respond, first off?
Well, one person I interviewed, there's this very heavy-duty, angry-looking black plume on the other side of the river from where she lives, and there had been 4 other big fires around the city. People were already being evacuated temporarily. This woman who lived right in the middle of town was hosting one of these evacuated couples, and they were taking pictures of the plume across the river, but it was a novelty to them. It was like a rainbow. And then she went off to work in her Porsche, and it was a bluebird day, unseasonably hot, and so she dressed for the weather. She wore a skirt, which she hardly ever did, because it's a city of men, and being a woman working there is a very weird, overdetermined experience. And it's a little bit like maybe being a female prison guard in a prison, like there's just unwholesome energy is directed at you. And in spite of this, she dressed it in a festive way and went off in her Porsche. And when she came back down into town for lunch, the city had disappeared behind this black and red curtain. And she didn't even understand what she was looking at. It had happened so fast, it was so huge, that what a lot of people experienced was disorientation. They simply didn't have the space in their head to understand what was happening. So, and that was really interesting because I have my feelings about the petroleum industry and people who work in it, and there's a policy of climate denial in Alberta, and this wasn't denial. This wasn't people being obtuse. This was something so enormous and outside their experience that they simply didn't have the cognitive capacity to process it in a rational way.
It was just not computing.
It basically kind of created more of a short circuit. And so, and then, ash was falling, sky was completely orange. By 2 or 3 in the afternoon, you could only function in the city with headlights because it had turned black. It was so dark from except for things that were burning. And everybody realized, not from the authorities, but from their neighbors saying, my house is on fire, you should probably leave. Then this very herky-jerky, disorganized evacuation began, and with a miraculous outcome, which we can get into. But
I want to talk about the evacuation in a second, but I want to take a step back, because one of the things you do so well through the book is you draw out these moments of absurdity almost, this kind of sense where the reality people are facing does not compute with their expectation of the world as it should be. Yeah. And I think one of the scenes that, and I want to ask you about the authorities' reaction in a second, but one of the scenes in particular I'm thinking about involves the authorities, and that was when I think it was the fire chief in the radio station?
Yeah. Yeah, he's in the radio station, and this at 11 a.m. on May 3rd, massive fire outside of town, and the fire chief and the head of the wildfire service are on the air. Who's listening? Everyone's gone to work. Everyone's in school. So, to whoever's listening, they're saying, "Go to school, go to work. We think we've got a grip on this. All is good." And then right after that, around noon, a journalist brought the wildfire guy into the radio station, and it had a plate glass window that happened to look in the direction where the fire was. And it was a distant, you could barely see it, at 10 in the morning. But by 12:30, it had achieved crossover, which is basically where the humidity and the temperature divide in a particular way that really energizes fire. You have that here in Australia too, for sure. And so that was happening, and it changed the quality of the smoke coming up behind these neighborhoods. And so we see the interviewer who described this to me in detail. You hear this guy, the wildfire manager, just repeating by rote these almost kind of platitude-like anodyne directives about what people should do, which was don't do anything rash, go to work, do your thing, and we've got this in hand. But he's watching with his eyes as the smoke changes, and he knows, he understands, because he's a wildfire person, he understands what's happening. And then he kind of cuts the interview and hustles out of there, and that's when the first evacuation notice is issued. And so we see people, even the experts, even the people in charge who understand the gravity of the fire conditions, how dry it is, how hot it is, 2 years of drought, all of that, things that people in Australia, again, are very familiar with. And imagine the fire authority who understood that intellectually, but still couldn't make the leap to, my God, this is energy that could take over the city. And that's what you see kind of in real time as they start to put it together. And it's very hard to look at in retrospect. How could you not understand this when all the fire codes, the drought moisture code, the temperature, the wind, everything was pointing to firestorm conditions? How could you not get it? And I think intellectually they got it, but they didn't get it existentially. And so that's what we see in this kind of tortured way as this city, one of the wealthiest in North America, where people have enormous agency and enormous confidence in their ability to meet challenges, are overwhelmed by an energy they've never encountered and have no equipment to respond to.
And I want to ask you about the evacuation, because there's a concept in sociology called elite panic. And it's where decision makers, in decision-making roles across the board, assume that when bad news gets broken, the average person will freak out and behave very badly and break the rules, and chaos will reign. And you have this... Your description of the evacuation of these places is vivid and haunting and in some ways beautiful, despite the awful circumstances you were describing. Could you talk about what happened as people evacuated from these neighborhoods, as they evacuated from the city?
So it's a petroleum town, so everybody is there to do one thing. They might have different jobs, but it's all to serve the industry. It's a one-industry town. It's a young town. And a lot of them are living in very new developments. Some of these houses are only a year old. Because it's a supercharged, superheated economy, these houses are, start at $500,000 and go up from there. Again, with these new developments, you probably have this in Australia too, there's only one road in. People haven't really thought about, well, we should probably have an alternate exit road in case that one is blocked by fire. This is a really serious issue across a lot of the Western world and places in general, especially where there's new rapid development going in. And they are realizing that their community is on fire in a very uneven way. And again, a lot of it is word of mouth. And what's extraordinary is somehow everybody did the right thing. And that's statistically impossible. This is a city of 80 or 90,000 people where, there are drug problems there. There are people who have worked, pulled 2 or 3 12-hour shifts. People are sleeping at odd hours. This industry runs around the clock, so you have people sleeping in the daytime. And you also have many different languages and ethnicities there. And it's a kind of a melting pot. And so to make a long story short, there was a 100% success rate with the evacuation. No one knew this for days. They kept, as they eventually started sifting through these burnt basements, of which there were thousands. They were expecting to find bones or something. They never found any, and they realized we had a 100% successful evacuation. And of course, that's because it was Canadians but here's the thing. And so I could feel really, really good about that until I found out what a Canadian was, which made me feel even better about it. Because in 2016, the year of the fire, there was that census that revealed the median household income of $200,000 a year. Also, the other thing that census revealed was that there were 80 first languages spoken in Fort McMurray in 2016. So it's like Toronto or Sydney in terms of its international nature. And so you have the languages, the ethnicities, the religions, the different concepts of what risk is, the different concepts of what community is. And yet somehow, between police, firefighters, and citizens going door to door, every single person got out. And it's amazing. And this is not happening in Turkey right now, where we have a lot of fatalities. Didn't happen in LA, where 30 people were killed. Didn't happen in Paradise, where nearly 100 were killed. Didn't happen in Valparaiso last spring, where 200 people were killed. People generally die in conflagrations, and there's been a lot of them over the past decade. And so Fort McMurray had this strange mercy visited upon it. And a lot of people work in the petroleum industry, so they have fire consciousness, but that doesn't explain a 100% success rate. And I'm kind of hoping a sociologist will go up there and analyze the escape, because it's never been repeated and probably never will be. And so Canada got a pass, and their response to that, though, was to rebuild the city exactly as it was and to increase petroleum production and to be in complete denial about what happened.
on the evacuation, there are some incredible scenes. For instance, the people waiting in line in the car as the fire burned on both sides of the highway. And what you described was this incredible sense of solidarity and mutual aid. When the chips were down, people stepped up. For instance, the journalist you spoke of, I think he stayed until the very bitter end to evacuate to make sure the word got out. As the guy in the radio station was broadcasting to the last to make sure word got out. And the other thing I wanted to ask you before, I wanted to kind of pull the camera back and ask some bigger picture questions in a second, but the final thing is the response, the firefighters, the people on the front line who were responding to this thing. You had an incredibly respectful, incredible stories that you spoke to these people about. Can you talk about some of how they responded, how they had to learn on the fly in response to what was?
So, no firefighter there had ever seen a fire like this, because there really has never been a fire like that burning in Canada before, through a community that was generating the energy. And so, very quickly, radiant heat is the invisible heat that tells you not to touch the candle. And when you have a wall of flame 100 meters tall and 10 kilometers wide sweeping in, it's projecting radiant heat of about 500 Celsius into the community. So it's desiccating everything. And if you have vinyl siding on your house, of course, that's melting off. And because the modern house, here in Australia too, is composed heavily of petrochemicals, at that temperature, all those petrochemicals start to vaporize. And so what you have is a gigantic gas can full of flammable vapor, except that's your house, that's your neighborhood, that's your city. And so, and the other thing that's happening with that kind of heat is it's generating ferocious wind. And so you have ember showers, sort of 50,000 embers per acre landing on these unburned houses. And instead of the house catching on fire, because of all the vapor, the house explodes into flame. And so I got through to some firefighters finally. That's a sort of a closed environment, and it's kind of hard to break in there, and I managed to do it with the help of another forest firefighter. And talking with these guys, and they said, the houses were burning down in 5 minutes. And I was sure that this guy was exaggerating or, like 5 minutes. And I pressed him, and I said, 5 minutes, like, what do you mean? From no fire on the house to fire in the basement with nothing standing in 5 minutes. And these are, $500,000 houses that weigh 50 tons. These are proper homes. And they began to modify their firefighting technique by, there's no way they could get to a house quickly enough when it's burning 5 minutes, so they would basically figure out which way the fire was going and then count down the houses, and it takes 20 minutes to set up at a hydrant, and so they would count down 4 houses and start on that house, and the previous 4 would burn. And in many cases, the heat was so intense that they simply had to issue a mayday and just evacuate the fire trucks and everything, and to the point that they were leaving hoses in the hydrants, and which is something you never do. It's like a soldier leaving their gun behind. There's certain things that are just ingrained into your behavior, and you do not leave any equipment behind, or obviously any of your firefighting crew. And all they could manage to do was to get out with their trucks, and they managed to, bring the civilians. And this is something I think that, we hadn't hit yet, but Australians have, where the firefighting operation turns into a life-saving operation where all you can do is try to get as many people out as you can, and you can't. The structures are so involved with fire that there's nothing water can meaningfully do.
And in describing some of those responses and that learning on the fly, you also talk with great respect about kind of working class knowledge and experience. You talk about guys from trades who are on these fire crews, responding in real time to what was in front of them effectively. Can you, where does, and a lot of people would miss that. Where does that come from?
One of the more interesting interviews I had was with heavy equipment operators so the fire burnt for many days and nights. This is exhausting for firefighters. A lot of these guys didn't sleep for 48 hours, 56 hours, 72 hours. So you're hallucinating by then. But they're fighting for their city. There is no help coming. They're on their own in there. In many cases, their superiors don't even know where they are. They're kind of caught behind enemy lines trying to save a school or some piece of a neighborhood or maybe the airport. And at one point, the fire was moving so quickly through this one housing development that they just realized the only way they're going to stop it is to basically plow a fire break through the neighborhood. In other words, tear all the standing houses down to keep it from going into the next neighborhood. So this is day 3 or 4. It's 4 in the morning, pitch dark except for the fire, and these bulldozer and backhoe operators are brought in and told to plow every car they see in the street through the wall and into the basement of the nearest house, and then plow the house down on top of it. And these are, again, $600,000 houses that are literally brand new, finished that year. And so these guys are just kind of doing what they're told, and they don't have protective gear on. The fire is there raging, and their solidarity for each other, their concern for each other, and their bravery and their incredible expertise under pressure was kind of unmistakable and fascinating. And these are, these guys had never been interviewed by anybody before, and they're humble working guys, paid extraordinarily well, but pretty low-key people. And it's just a fascinating section of the book, hearing these guys who are experts with heavy equipment talk about the subtleties of heavy equipment under the most kind of terrifying and dangerous circumstances that they've ever operated in. And so that just gave me a sense of who these people really were. And again, I live in Vancouver. It's kind of a lefty liberal enviro scene that I come out of, and so I have a lot of baggage, around the petroleum industry. And I quickly learned that that's not going to help me in my reporting. And so I really tried to leave as much of that behind as I could and just kind of approach these folks as human beings with a very specific kind of expertise. And that paid off handsomely because we get to meet people who normally nobody ever bothers to interview. And they helped save that city. And it was heroic, what they did. And so I feel really proud of them and lucky to have had the opportunity to interview them.
There's almost a sense as well for people that when you give them a chance to be noble, some people will take that opportunity under the most trying circumstances.
Oh, I think most people will. They have pride in their town. And ultimately, I think, and you hear this from soldiers all the time, I'm just trying to save my guys. And that kind of solidarity is what kept the fire department together and kept these support teams who are working with them, heavy equipment operators, water truck drivers, and cops, who are all trying to manage this absolutely chaotic and also, by the way, lethally toxic situation. So there's really few things more toxic than the cumulative smoke from a burning house. There's a bazillion chemicals in there, and one thing that's quite poignant, these firefighters who spent a week nonstop trying to fight this fire are all pretty clear that their lives have been shortened. The same way the people who were clearing away the Twin Towers after 9/11, people who are clearing up after Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, just the soup of poisons that are ambient and released from normally stable and inert objects is overwhelming. And these guys who saved the city are going to pay the ultimate price for that.
And this is probably a very good point where I want to kind of pull the camera back a little bit, because you do a great job throughout the book of talking about fire and humanity's relationship to fire. And I'm curious if you could talk a little about how you see that relationship.
So as I was writing along, I got more curious about the nature of fire, because speaking with these firefighters, they ascribed a kind of personality to this fire. This fire was named the Beast while it was burning. It's really the only fire anywhere in the world that has been named in that way that I'm aware of. And so, the Beast is up again. I was battling with the beast over in this neighborhood. I was battling with it over there. And I started kind of pressing, and these guys are not poets and they're not scientists, they're firefighters. But they had this relationship with this entity that clearly had agency and a kind of ambition. And so I asked a very unscientific question, just rhetorically, which was, is fire alive? And the second question was, do humans and fire have a common ancestor? And these are questions no scientist would ask, and firefighters don't ask that question either, and that's why we have journalists to ask kind of unprofessional, improbable questions. But it led me to a much more nuanced understanding of fire, which has almost all the characteristics of a living thing except for sentience. So in terms of its power to reproduce, its versatility of diet, its ability to wait and to smolder, to be dormant and then to reawaken. I made a whole list of those qualities. And then that led me into, what's driving it, and which is oxygen, and that's kind of our common ancestor. We are burning events also. We just take 80 years to burn up, and fires burn much more quickly, but we're all oxidizing. Fire is a rapid oxidation event, and you are a slow oxidation event, but we're all oxidizing. So that made me think about petroleum in a different way, and our kinship with fire, which accompanies us everywhere we go, to the point that we don't even realize it. And so, when I turn on the hot water, I'm activating fire, but to me, all I'm feeling is a nice warm shower. When I get in the car, I get to go where I want to go, but hundreds of thousands of combustions are taking me there. And so I counted the number of fires that human beings make daily, and including internal combustions, it's on the order of tens of trillions. So if you could see all the fires that we make just going about our daily lives, it would be like galaxies of fire, none of which would burn in circumstances like this. My God, this is a very, very impressive rain you've got here.
It is very ironic.
And
But just to focus in there, you mentioned petroleum, and one of the things you talk about is the way in which fossil fuels, coal, oil, gas, can be thought of as fire in a bottle.
Yeah. And I think it took me 7 years to understand. It took me 7 years to write this book, and it took me 7 years to figure out that the petroleum industry is a wholly owned subsidiary of fire. That's its principal utility to us, is its flammability. And so we've devoted this, a global infrastructure. A third of all international shipping is devoted to transporting fire energy. And that's what drives us, that's what empowers our economy, that's what it has enabled us to be together right now, that's what enabled me to join you from Vancouver, that's what has enabled most of us to achieve the wealth we have. However humble that might be, most of that is thanks to petroleum. So we owe an enormous debt to petroleum, even as its externalities, which have not been factored in, which CO2 and methane, are now actively taking those gains away from us, town by town, city by city, forest by forest. And so we're in this very early stage of understanding both the debt we owe petroleum, and at the same time, the collection process that a superheated climate is costing us. So we've never been here before, folks, and it's new.
And I think you have the word for it as the piracy, and you describe it as, right?
Yeah, there's a really kind of the eminence grise, the OG of fire writing and science is a guy named Stephen Pine, who came out of Arizona State University, but started as a wildfire fighter in his teens, in the Grand Canyon, which is now has one of the worst fires in Arizona history burning in it as I speak to you right now, the Dragon Bravo fire. So that's where he cut his teeth. And after the Fort McMurray fire in 2016, he wrote an article for Slate magazine, and he coined the term the Pyrocene, and he basically said that is the era we're in. So last 12,000 years was the Holocene epoch. It's what enabled, it was the kind of relatively stable climate conditions that allowed us to build the civilization that we've come to know and enjoy. The Pyrocene, what I call 21st century fire, we're also seeing it in flooding and in terms of drought and temperature peaks, is a new world. It's a post-Holocene. And that's what we're entering now and having to come to grips with.
And another dimension of this that I forgot to mention is you had a great, your description of the relationship between humanity and fire was excellent, but you also use it as a metaphor to describe the way in which our economic and financial systems operate. So not only does fire kind of emulate a living thing, we emulate fire in the way that we go about our process of extraction. Is that right?
I think so. I think capitalism follows the model of fire. And so when a fire reaches a certain size, and this is something you're painfully familiar with, it is unstoppable, and it's able to bend any situation to its advantage. So if it's coming out of the forest and into a tent full of plastic chairs, it is going to rage just as hot because it can make those chairs off-gas and combust. And then it can move on, to the houses, move on to the cars. It can manipulate any situation to its benefit. And this is what large corporations are also able to do. And again, the goal is growth, and growth at any cost. And fire has no conscience, and it has, one job, which is to combust as broadly and charismatically as it possibly can. That's what oxygen compels it to do. But it's very interesting to watch Standard Oil under the leadership of John D. Rockefeller, or Amazon under the leadership of Jeff Bezos, watch how they move across a landscape. And it's really quite similar. And it really got me thinking, it's sort of probably something for another book and maybe probably a finer mind, but looking at the connection between capitalism and oxygen. And I think the urgency of oxygen, we're all calm now, breathing, but if we were not to breathe for 60 seconds, and then couldn't get a breath, our behavior would change radically. And we would have some sense of the urgency of fire. And that's, fire is trying to keep the party going, to keep the combustion happening. And we see that with our current economic system, which is keeping this party going. And we see that the petroleum industry is a powerful driver of that, even flying in the face of really basic, well-accepted climate science. It wants to keep the growth and keep the speed. And it's disastrous. And we see what happened with the fire. The fire will eventually burn out, exhaust itself, leaving a wasteland behind it. And there are analogies to be seen there in terms of the impacts of capitalism on a landscape.
Now, and just before we go on, in about 5 minutes, we're going to go to questions. So just while you think of some pressing questions to ask our guest, I want to ask you one final question before we kind of move to that, which is, and this is something that I picked up on through the book, and I have also found in my own work as a reporter and journalist, is that you spent so much time talking to people who had, in some cases, been close to death, who had experienced something terribly traumatic, who had been through incredibly scary moments. But and in the process of doing that, you then recorded those conversations, and then you had to process those conversations, and then write those conversations. And I'm wondering how you dealt with the kind of vicarious trauma of piecing that together and laying it out next to each other.
Yeah. I'm glad you asked that. That's a real thing. For people who are working in climate, we're seeing terrible things. And the people who went through that fire, some of you may have gone through these fires. You've seen terrible things. And 10 years ago, if you'd asked people in Canada if they knew anybody who'd been evacuated due to fire, it would be very spotty. And now I think you could ask any Canadian, the entire country of 44 million people, and everybody knows somebody who's been evacuated, or else they've been evacuated themselves. So I would say that PTSD is now an epidemic in Canada. And if you're an empathic person, and you kind of have to be a journalist, that's part of how you get people to trust you and share the worst days of their lives with you. It's a perverse thing to want to do professionally, but I'm compelled to do it. I know Royce is too, and we have a role to play, but you're also taking in that trauma too, and going to these places and seeing the totality of the destruction, what a modern fire can do. There was one in Redding, California, 2 years after Fort McMurray that generated an EF3 tornado, and I walked that landscape right after the fire, and it looked like photos I'd seen of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It was complete and total destruction on a vast scale, and nothing was left. And I did not have gray hair when I started this book, and now I do. And it's and you take it in, and people, these tough oil dudes are crying in front of me, describing how scared they were and how scared they were for their family, and it's impossible not to shed a tear also. You're living this experience through them, and you might be the first person they've told the whole thing to. And sometimes these stories would take 3 or 4 hours to unfold as they described their evacuation process, which was grindingly slow because tens of thousands of other cars were also trying to leave at the same time, and everything was on fire. I mean, it is an absolute bona fide miracle that nobody was killed, because everyone's driving like at a Starbucks drive-through lineup speed, trying to get out, and yet they kept it together.
Did it change you?
I would absolutely, and in that sense, I don't know if you're familiar with the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, but that famous poem, it begins with this crazy old guy sitting outside of a church, and he accosts this young man on the way into a wedding and says, "I got to tell you." And that's I've been doing this for 2 years around the world, and I feel compelled to tell people, because it's really bad, and it can happen to us, and it feels incredibly urgent to me, and I honestly don't want other people to suffer the way the people I met and interviewed suffered. So yeah, it did change me.
And with that, we're going to take a few questions now. So we have many questions. Where should we begin? The volunteer?
I think there's a mic.
Do we have a roving mic? Oh, this one doesn't work. Okay, we're getting a substitute mic. We'll be back.
Okay.
Oh, we're good. Apologies.
We're live.
So, questions?
Yeah. Got some in the front here.
I'll let you do the honors. You can choose.
Okay, right here, there's a fellow front and center.
Thank you, John. Your book is a warning to us all. Many of us were in 2019, and I was personally evacuated just 15 minutes from here.
Wow.
In 2019, Greg Mullins also warned our government and wrote a book called Firestorm, at the Australian condition. Mm-hmm. You're calling it out. It happened again in Jasper last year.
Yeah.
Our government just approved the biggest carbon bomb in history. What is the Canadian government doing? Because we're not learning here.
I'm living your reality too, and Canada is very heavily influenced, not quite owned, but pretty close to it by the petroleum lobby. The anxiety around the United States, driven by Trump's aggressive language about annexing Canada, has made it imperative for Canada to become more self-sufficient. Energy, petroleum is what they have to sell, and so they're actively, seeking new pipeline permits and new markets for their fossil fuels as a kind of national survival strategy. And so we have a very, probably one of the smartest prime ministers Canada's ever had, this guy, Mark Carney, very sophisticated guy, fully understands the climate risk that we find ourselves in, but he's also beholden to the petroleum industry that helped him get elected, and to what Canada has that's fungible right now, which is petroleum products. And so we are really behind in the energy transition, which, by the way, folks, is happening. And Australia is actually making great progress on renewable energy. Texas, again, you could say the Alberta of the United States, conservative, climate-denying oil state, is producing more wind and solar and adding to that more rapidly than any other state in North America. And you'd think California would be the leader or New York would be the leader. Well, Texas is the leader. And so we find progress in some strange and unlikely places, which means I think we don't need to agree with everybody on everything in order to move in the right direction. But Canada right now is woefully behind, and I follow Australia and energy and climate issues kind of off the side of my desk. Australia gets a lot of attention in part 3 of fire weather because you are so important to the fire story and the energy and climate change story. And we have a lot to learn from Australians. What that study revealed to me is how similar Canada's and Australia's policies and lack of policy are. I think, though, honestly, I think Australia, believe it or not, is a little ahead of Canada. And I would have objectively assumed it might be the opposite, but it isn't.
So we're struggling to kick our carbon addiction, I think, is the issue here.
Yeah.
So other questions? We're going to go pink, lady in pink.
Yeah.
Just going on from the last question, have you noticed, you mentioned that the fire was something that people had never experienced before, had never had anything like it in Fort McMurray.
Yeah.
Now, can you see any change, either in attitudes around that area? So not so much on Canada as the whole country, but has that triggered a change, and whatever change you can see?
It's very spotty, but there's definitely action at the community level. And for example, Steamboat Springs, Colorado, has a very proactive urban fire group who is really trying to, improve evacuation policy, improve defensible space. I don't know if you use the same language here in Australia, but this notion of defensible space around a house, around a neighborhood, around a community. And so we're seeing, but I so far haven't seen provincial policy or national policy. And yet at the same time, we in Canada have a program called FireWise, which is, Fire Smart. It's FireWise in the US. Fire Smart, where members of fire departments will come into your cul-de-sac or backyard or community meeting and talk to you about how you can basically harden your community against wildfire impacts. And so that part is definitely happening. I think also what we're seeing, because there have been so much fire in Canada over the past few years, that there's a lot more preemptive evacuation, because Fort McMurray was an absolute gong show. And again, it is a miracle that nobody died there. And a death toll of hundreds would have been totally plausible under the circumstances, and that would have been a national catastrophe that we would still be reeling from. And we got to pass that time, and a number of municipal leaders now and fire chiefs understand how lucky Fort McMurray was in terms of loss of life, that there was none. And so now people are a bit more conservative in terms of getting people out sooner. That feels like progress to me. In terms of actually fighting fire, we don't really have the means. Water doesn't work against fires of this intensity. And you can lay down fire retardant, but the Dixie Fire in California a couple years ago, it cast viable embers 10 miles. They started fires 10 miles away. There's no way you can build a fire break against that. Likewise with pyrocumulonimbus fire clouds, which occur here, which occur in places where they've never occurred before now, they generate lightning, same way volcanoes do. And so they can start a fire 30 or 40 miles away from the center of the fire action. And again, there's no fire break, no amount of water is going to stop that. So we're entering this, a truly different reality in terms of what fire is capable of doing, and we are catching up to that very, very slowly. But there are individuals in different communities. I find them everywhere I go, where people have either taken the message of fire weather to heart or had their own experiences, really hard-won lessons learned. And, I think that's another place, though, where I think Australia is probably ahead of the game, ahead of the rest of us, and where we have a lot to learn. I think Australia, and in terms of larger entities, I feel like Australia and California would be the two most progressive places, and Southern Australia and California. And but it's a big question, but it's very erratic, very sporadic right now.
I think we have time for one more quick question. Do we have time? Yes? All right, so we'll try over this side of the room.
Fellow right there, eagerly waving in a blue jacket, directly in front of you. Yeah. Yeah. There we go.
Yeah, thank you. And while we hate using North Americanisms in Australia, I think perhaps we need to start calling them wildfires as opposed to bushfires, because they are ferocious.
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask you, with your work, how much do you believe that heating is so baked into the system, whatever we do in the short term, that we're going to see many more horrific fires of this nature in unexpected places?
Yeah. I have to be pretty sanguine about that. When you look at CO2, when you look at methane, when you look at temperature, when you look at the U.S. debt, they're all going in one direction, and pretty steeply. And so when you look at what's happening in the south of France right now, pretty much the worst fire in their history, literally right now, and you look at across the eastern Mediterranean, lethal and catastrophic fire is burning in several different countries. And we got a ways to go this summer. So I think we can expect a lot more of it. And in terms of it being baked in, there's a lot of anxiety around, justified anxiety around the state of permafrost in the far north and the amount of methane that is trapped there and that is released as it melts. And methane is a really potent greenhouse gas. So on the good news, it's looking like China's CO2 emissions are plateauing and are probably going to go into decline as they catch up with renewable energy, which they've been leaning into harder than anybody else combined. And so, a lot of naysayers will say, yeah, but look at all the coal plants they're building. They are building a lot of coal plants, but increasingly those are backups for the wind and solar. And the wind and solar is now finally catching up so that their emissions are plateauing and are probably going to decrease. And whether that's, that is historic planetary change, given the size of their economy and energy needs. But then you have, the U.S., going into regression. But the rest of the world is dialing into this energy transition that is en route, that I would say is inevitable. It's not going to happen as fast as the smartphone happened, but it's absolutely happening. Solar is the cheapest energy ever conceived, and it's being laid on at a rate that we've never seen before. So, but we're going to see more fire too, and we have to get ready for it.
We should also say as well that every ounce of carbon prevented from entering the atmosphere does have a positive effect as well. Yeah. So things are changing.
So the last thing I would want to end on is planet Earth's default mode is abundance and flourishing. And that's what it always returns to after every fire, after every flood, after every drought. Things grow back. It may not be the same things, but this is a ferocious growing engine that we are lucky enough to live on. It's extraordinarily powerful. And one of the things I learned from a book I wrote called The Tiger is, as soon as you stop killing tigers, they breed like cats. They come back ferociously. As long as there is a prey base, they will just expand and flourish. So, and we've seen that when we've taken dams out of rivers in the United States, how quickly the fish come back and the birds come back. So, there's a lot of very good and potent energy out there that we're part of and that we can participate in and enable.
So with that, we're going to wrap this session. Before you go, don't rush off. I want to say thank you to the volunteers today. Thank you to you guys for being here. And please, for those of us who work with words, this is our life, our heart, our living, and our art. Thank you for being here to support this. Thank you for being here to support John. Please go buy the book, queue out the door to get it signed, ask him all your questions, be here for an hour. We appreciate you being here under these circumstances.
Yeah.
And please, make John feel very welcome.